a 6-year-old girl, vanished on her walk home from school. 6 days later, she was found alive, locked inside a metal box buried in the desert. This is the true story of June Robles, and what happened to her still shocks people to this day. June Robles was born in 1927 in Tucson, Arizona, during a time when the world was changing fast. America was deep in the Great Depression. Jobs were scarce. Families were holding on to what little they had. And yet, in the middle of it all, the Robles family had something that couldn't be shaken: respect. June's grandfather, Elias Robles, was one of the most respected figures in southern Arizona. A former state senator, he was known for helping working families, pushing for education, and being a steady voice in a time of hardship. He was the kind of man whose name carried weight, and that meant his family, including little June, lived with both pride and pressure. June's father, Fernando Robles, was a hard-working man with strong ties in the community. He had married and built a life for his family in the heart of Tucson. Their home wasn't fancy, but it was filled with love, books, and the sound of children's laughter. June was one of several siblings, but people said she stood out in quiet ways, not because she was loud, but because she was kind, curious, and always paying attention. She attended St. Joseph's Academy, a Catholic school just a few blocks from her home. Each day, she wore a simple green dress, white socks, and well-kept shoes. Her hair was often pulled back neatly, and she carried her school satchel with pride. She walked to school with confidence, even though she was small for her age. She had a routine, and everyone around her knew it. June would leave school around 3 p.m. and walk to her aunt's house nearby. Her parents trusted the neighborhood. Most families did. Tucson was a growing city, but it still had that small-town feeling where people waved from their porches and children played outside until the streetlights came on. Kids walked home alone. It wasn't strange. It was normal. Her teachers described her as respectful, smart, and always focused. At 6 years old, she was already reading far ahead of her grade level. She loved stories, especially the kind where the hero finds a way out of trouble. She wasn't the loudest child in class, but when she spoke, people listened. There was a thoughtfulness in her eyes. Even then, at home, June was known for helping with chores without being asked. She played gently with her younger siblings and often sat beside her grandmother, quietly listening to old family stories. Neighbors remembered her as polite, the kind of child who always said please and thank you, and never left the yard without asking. The Robles family, despite their status, didn't live in luxury. They were comfortable, but they worked hard for everything they had. Their name carried meaning in Tucson, and that came with expectations. People looked up to them, but that respect also brought attention. Some good, some not. And that's what made what happened in April 1934 so strange, because nothing about June's life pointed to danger. There was no family trouble, no enemies, no money problems that people knew about. The Robles family wasn't flashy. They weren't involved in shady politics. They were known for doing things the right way, which is why, when June vanished, it didn't make sense. How could a child who had never wandered off simply disappear? How could someone take her in broad daylight without anyone noticing? And more importantly, why her? Those questions would haunt the family for years. Even decades later, older residents of Tucson would say the same thing. June was the last child you'd expect this to happen to. She wasn't careless. She wasn't the kind of kid who talked to strangers. She had been raised to be careful, respectful, and smart. And yet, all the things that should have kept her safe didn't. That's what made her story different. It wasn't just that she was taken. It was who she was, how she lived, and how suddenly her world was pulled out from under her, without warning, without noise, without a trace. She had left school that afternoon, just like she always did. Same time, same street, same routine. But that day, someone was waiting. And from that moment on, nothing in Tucson or in the Robles family would ever be the same. Wednesday, April 25th, 1934, started like any other warm spring day in Tucson, Arizona. 6-year-old June Robles had dressed herself for school that morning in a clean green dress and a light sweater. Her books were packed neatly in her satchel. She said goodbye to her parents, left the family home, and walked toward St. Joseph's Academy, the small Catholic school she attended. It was a short walk, just a few blocks, and June had done it many times before. School that day was normal. Her teacher later recalled that June seemed calm and focused. She had taken part in class, turned in her assignments, and was excited to visit her aunt's house after the final bell. Her route never changed. She would leave the front gate of the school, walk north on North Tucson Boulevard, then turn left toward her aunt's home on East 3rd Street. The entire walk would take less than 10 minutes, but June never arrived. When she didn't show up by 3:30 p.m., her aunt grew concerned. She called June's parents, hoping there had been some change in plans, but there hadn't. That's when the panic began to rise. The family began retracing her steps. Neighbors were called, teachers were asked, but no one had seen anything unusual. According to one classmate, June had left school right on time. A few students mentioned seeing her standing on the sidewalk near a parked car, a black sedan, but no one thought much of it at the time. She hadn't looked frightened or upset. She had just been there and then gone. By early evening, June's family contacted the police. At first, the response was cautious. It was 1934, before modern child abduction protocols. Officers wondered if June had gotten lost or wandered off. Perhaps she had gone to visit a friend and lost track of time. But June wasn't the type to wander. She followed rules. She knew her path, and her parents knew she wouldn't take a different route without telling someone. Then, a telegram arrived. It was addressed to June Robles, June's grandfather. The message was chilling in its simplicity. Don't call police or you'll never see her again. $15,000 or she dies. Instructions will follow. The note was postmarked from downtown Tucson and had no return address. It was carefully typed. The language was direct. Whoever had taken June knew exactly what they were doing. That single message changed everything. The police began to take the case seriously. Detectives spread out across the neighborhood, asking questions, inspecting cars, interviewing anyone who might have seen something unusual. Volunteers joined the effort. Families locked their doors for the first time in years. Local newspapers published the story the next morning, placing June's name and photograph on the front page. Within hours, her face was known across the state. Still, there was no second note, no call, no directions for the ransom drop. The Robles family waited by the phone. Hours turned into days. Hope turned into fear. As the city searched, small pieces of information started to surface. A shopkeeper near the school reported seeing a man in a dark overcoat standing beside a car at the same time June would have passed by. A child across the street remembered a car door slamming shut and a girl's satchel falling to the ground, but it was picked up quickly by someone and the car drove off. None of the witnesses got a license plate. No one had a clear look at the driver. Police sent out alerts to other towns. They notified border checkpoints and train stations. Flyers were posted in Phoenix, Albuquerque, and even El Paso. The FBI quietly stepped in to assist. Kidnapping was becoming more common, and after the tragic Lindbergh baby case just 2 years earlier, federal agents knew time was everything. The strange part was that no one tried to collect the ransom. For all the planning behind the abduction and the message, there were no follow-up instructions, no communication, no money was exchanged. It was as if the kidnapper wanted to send a message, not make a profit. For 6 long days, Tucson held its breath. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said it was political revenge, aimed at the Robles family. Others thought it was personal, someone jealous of their influence. A few even believed it was a sick game, played by someone who just wanted to watch the panic unfold. June's parents, meanwhile, barely slept. They waited beside the phone. They scanned every shadow. They pleaded with God and searched every face in every crowd. But June didn't return. Not yet. The city was slowly starting to give up hope. The desert was vast, and the days were growing hotter. If she was still out there, many feared time was running out. And then, on the 6th day, someone came forward. A man led police deep into the desert, just outside Tucson. He said he had heard talk about a strange place in the sand, something hidden, something buried. By the morning of May 1st, 1934, 6 days had passed since June Robles vanished. Tucson was no longer just worried, it was exhausted. Search teams had covered miles of desert. Officers were working in shifts with no sleep. The Robles family waited by the phone, hoping, praying, dreading every silent hour that passed. The first ransom note had warned them not to contact police, but they had no choice. It had been days with no follow-up instructions, no confirmation that June was even alive. The newspapers called it Arizona's most desperate search. Radios updated the public every few hours. The story had gone national, but the trail was ice cold. And then something changed. Late that afternoon, a man approached local authorities. His name was never made fully public, but his story was odd from the start. He claimed he had overheard someone, possibly in a bar, mention a location in the desert outside Tucson where something suspicious had been hidden. A strange patch of ground, rocks piled in a certain way, air holes poked in the sand. It didn't make sense, he said, but it had stayed in his mind. With no better leads, police followed him. The group drove several miles outside the city, into the dry hills north of Tucson. The terrain was dusty and cracked, dotted with cactus and sunburned rocks. There was no trail, no road, no clear marker. But the man led them to a clearing and pointed. There, beneath a small stack of stones and dirt, was a piece of metal. They began to dig. It didn't take long. What they uncovered was something no one had prepared for. A long, narrow metal box, about the size of a child's coffin. It was bolted shut, with small holes punched through the sides for air. It was locked tight. No sound came from inside. One officer called for a crowbar. Another said a prayer. They forced the box open. Inside was June Robles. She was alive. She had been lying in total darkness for nearly 144 hours. Her tiny body was curled up in the cramped space, wrapped in a single gray blanket. Beside her was a half-empty jug of water, a small can of beans, and a rusted spoon. The box had been buried just deep enough to hide, but not deep enough to suffocate her. Ventilation holes had been carefully placed, and the box had been insulated to prevent the full heat of the desert from cooking the inside. Whoever had done this had planned it well. June was conscious, but weak. Her skin was pale, her lips were dry and cracked. She couldn't stand on her own. Her eyes squinted against the sunlight after 6 days in complete blackness. Paramedics arrived within minutes and rushed her to St. Mary's Hospital. Nurses said she didn't speak for several hours. When she finally whispered, her first word was, "Mama." The entire city let out a breath. Crowds gathered outside the hospital. Newspaper headlines screamed, "Desert grave yields living child." June Robles found alive after 6 days. Miracle in Arizona. Doctors said it was a miracle she had survived. A child of her age trapped underground in the desert heat should not have lived. The limited food, the water, the ventilation, it was all just barely enough to keep her alive. It was clear this wasn't a crime of impulse. It had been mapped out in detail. Someone had built that box. Someone had chosen the spot. Someone had watched June and waited for the right moment to take her. But who? The man who had discovered the box was questioned extensively. Investigators didn't believe in coincidences. His story was vague, inconsistent, and he changed details under pressure. But there was no evidence directly tying him to the kidnapping. No fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no confessions. June was too traumatized to give a clear description of her captor. She said she had been led to the car by a man, but didn't remember his face. She had been told to stay quiet, locked in the box, left alone. The public wanted answers. The Robles family wanted justice, but there were none. No charges were filed, no arrest was made, and the ransom, it was never collected. The investigation only deepened the mystery. Why had the kidnapper gone through so much effort to build the box, deliver a threat, and then vanish without taking a cent? Was it a warning to the Robles family? A twisted act of revenge? Or something darker that no one had dared to name? One thing was certain. A child had been buried alive in the Arizona desert and survived. But the question of who had put her there would remain buried far longer. In the days following June Robles' rescue on May 1st, 1934, Tucson was flooded with a strange mix of relief, joy, and fear. The little girl who had vanished in broad daylight had been found alive, something nearly unheard of in that time. The photo of the metal box where she had been trapped made front pages across the country. People called it a miracle. But behind the celebration, there was a deeper question everyone was asking. Who had done this, and why? June, recovering in St. Mary's Hospital, was only 6 years old. She was shaken, quiet, and confused. At first, she didn't speak much at all. Her parents sat beside her, holding her hand, while detectives waited in the hallway. When she finally started talking, her answers came slowly, and not all of them made sense. She said she remembered a man. She said she had been told not to cry. She said she had been given food and water, but she couldn't describe his face, his voice, or his car. Doctors said she was suffering from emotional shock and extreme exhaustion. Her body had begun to heal, but her mind was trying to forget what it had just been through. It became clear early on they might not be able to rely on June's memory for answers, so investigators focused on the man who had led them to her. He had come forward with just enough information to make them suspicious. He said he had overheard a conversation in a bar. He said someone mentioned a strange box buried near the desert hills, but when pressed for names, times, or places, he had none. His story changed every time he was asked, and yet he insisted he wasn't involved. He said he was just trying to help. Police questioned him for hours. The FBI got involved. Agents searched his home, his workplace, and his personal contacts, but they found nothing. No tools, no maps, no materials that matched the construction of the box. No evidence that he had watched June or knew her routine. Then they searched the desert site again. They discovered that the box had been carefully made, sealed with bolts, lined with felt, and insulated with newspapers to keep out the heat. There were vents drilled near the head area to allow air to pass through, and the door had been secured with 2 heavy locks. Whoever had placed it there had visited the site more than once. There were tire tracks, faint footprints, and even scraps of wood used to level the box underground. But none of it led to a name, and the ransom, still unpaid. After the initial telegram on April 25th, no follow-up letters were received. No one came forward to collect the money. Police had set up controlled traps and surveillance just in case. They watched the Robles' home around the clock. They traced every suspicious phone call, but the silence remained. Then weeks later, a new letter arrived. It had been mailed anonymously from a nearby town. The letter said, "I didn't mean to hurt her. I just needed the money. I watched her for days. I thought it would be easy." The handwriting was shaky. The grammar was off. Some believed it was fake, written by someone seeking attention. Others were sure it came from the person who took June. But again, there were no fingerprints, no useful clues, and it led nowhere. Over the next several months, police investigated dozens of suspects. A former employee of the Robles family was questioned. So was a man recently released from prison who had once lived in Tucson. There were even whispers about political enemies of Elias Robles, the grandfather, who may have wanted to harm the family's reputation or send a message. But every theory hit a wall. The local sheriff eventually told the press, "We know more than we can say, but not enough to prove anything." It was a frustrating answer, and it left the public with even more questions. As for the box, it was stored as evidence, photographed by the FBI, and examined by experts. One engineer said it had been designed to keep someone alive, not to endanger them. That single detail changed how many people viewed the case. Maybe the kidnapper hadn't planned for June to die. Maybe it wasn't about cruelty, but desperation. Still, the trauma was real. She had spent 6 full days in darkness, in fear, in isolation. Whether or not her life had been at risk, her innocence had been taken. By late 1934, the case had gone cold. No one was arrested. No one was charged. And June, who had survived something no child ever should, was left with more questions than answers. She returned to her family, but the mystery remained. In the end, the box had been found, but the truth never was. In the months following June Robles' rescue, on May 1st, 1934, Tucson tried to return to normal, but it never really did. Her survival had become a national sensation. Newspapers from coast to coast had called it the Desert Miracle. Strangers sent cards, letters, and gifts to the Robles home. Reporters camped outside her school. For a time, it seemed like the entire country was watching the little girl who had come back from the grave. But behind the headlines, there were no answers. Despite a long and highly public investigation, the identity of June's kidnapper remained a mystery. No charges were ever filed, no suspects were officially named, and no new evidence ever surfaced that could bring the case to a close. The metal box, where June had been held, carefully crafted, hidden beneath the Arizona sun, was put into police storage and later lost over time. Whatever clues it once held disappeared with it. June returned to school a few weeks after her recovery, but her life would never be the same. Teachers said she became quieter, more withdrawn. She avoided loud noises and sudden movements. For a while, she wouldn't walk alone, not even in daylight. Her parents hired a private security guard to watch over the family. Their front door, once left unlocked like most homes in Tucson at the time, now had multiple bolts. Though she was only 6 years old, June seemed to understand that something had been taken from her, not just time or safety, but trust, and that loss would stay with her long after the newspapers moved on. Years passed. The story faded from national news, but in Tucson, people still remembered. June became a quiet figure in local history, not famous, but unforgettable. In 1945, she graduated from Tucson High School and later went on to marry and raise a family of her own. She rarely spoke about what happened. When she did, it was brief. She never gave interviews. She never tried to profit from the story. It was something she had lived through, and something she had chosen not to relive. Friends and neighbors described her as kind, private, and deeply resilient. One local resident said, "She never acted like a victim. She lived her life and kept her head high." Her name would appear again in the public eye only once, many decades later, when she passed away. On June 8, 2014, June Robles Burt died at the age of 87. Her obituary mentioned her family, her faith, and her strength, but not the box. The silence around her kidnapping had become part of the legacy itself. Still, her case left a mark. Though no one was ever brought to justice, the story of June's survival changed the way people in Arizona and across the country thought about child safety. In the 1930s, the idea of a child being taken in broad daylight was almost unthinkable. After June's case, that innocence was gone. Parents began to walk their children to and from school more often. Schools became more protective. Communities were more alert. Law enforcement, too, shifted. Though the Federal Bureau of Investigation had only recently begun handling kidnapping cases, thanks in part to the Lindbergh tragedy of 1932, the June Robles case showed how complex, calculated, and unsolved such crimes could be. The need for better tracking, evidence collection, and public coordination became clear. In time, June's story became part of Arizona folklore. Children heard it as a cautionary tale. Teachers shared it in classrooms during safety lessons. Locals passed it on, not as a story of horror, but of survival. A little girl, a locked box, a desert grave, and a life that refused to end. But perhaps the most haunting part of the story is what never came: an arrest, a confession, or closure. Some believed the crime had been politically motivated, aimed at the Robles family to send a warning. Others believed it was personal, the work of someone close to the family who knew June's daily routine and knew how to stay invisible. And then there were those who believed it was the act of a stranger, driven by money or madness, who simply slipped through the cracks of history. No theory was ever proven. No one was ever held accountable. And so, the box was found, but the truth was not. In the end, June Robles' story is one of survival, but also silence. A reminder that justice doesn't always come in courtrooms, and answers don't always follow miracles. It is a story that still lingers in the shadows of the desert, in the memory of a city that never forgot the little girl who was taken and came back. And maybe that's why it still matters, because even in the darkest places, sometime the light makes it out alive.